Hello from Beijing. I believe I'm patient zero of a future zombie outbreak. Hello, my English name is Amanda Liu and I'm a master's student at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. As you may agree, China is flawed from a political standpoint. Most of the people in my generation know this. To be fair, I have friends in the Western world who feel the same way about their own leaders. As we have seen recently, viruses have no borders and it is incredibly important that the world is aware of my condition. I resent having to use a VPN just to post on this. Government censors are preventing me from telling my story through any form of Chinese media. I want you to know before my death I would like to make my story known. The source of my illness did not come from food or animal origin. Some strange food is consumed here, but the strangest of these foods, like bats and pangolins, are only consumed by a very small percentage of the population. You could compare it to the number of Americans who eat possum or armadillo. I personally like Subway and Pizza Hut, which is very popular here. As part of my master's project, I traveled to a remote part of Yunnan province in order to document one of the world's rarest known mushrooms. It is known here only by its traditional name, which roughly translates to black brain fungus. The mycelium, which act like the roots of mushrooms, has only been found growing in underground caves deeper than 200 meters. No one has ever documented the fruiting of this mushroom, which is what happens when the mycelium produces its reproductive organs above ground. So you can imagine my joyous surprise when 300 m underground, in total darkness pierced only by my head torch, I stumbled upon the potentially first ever discovered fruiting specimen. The mushroom had a grayish brain-like texture on the cap. This brain was punctuated by a number of pores that oozed a tar-like liquid. One might be disturbed by its appearance, but to me it was beautiful. The smell, however, was that of rancid flesh, making me gag as I approached it. I took many photos, over 100 actually, wanting to capture it from all angles. I then attempted to take a spore print. To do this I have to cut off the cap of the mushroom, which I feel bad about doing, but it is essential to the further research of this species. As I begin to cut the stem, the cap suddenly inflates, like a puffer fish, the black tar squirting onto my gloves and shirt, and then, just as suddenly it deflates, leaving me choking on a cloud of dust like spores. Despite a ruined shirt and a lungful of spores, I bag the cap of the mushroom and begin my ascent above ground, followed by a very long train journey home to Beijing. The symptoms came the next day. Flu-like, headache, and loss of appetite. I also got my period 2 weeks early. I thought it could be coronavirus, but I had taken mandatory tests when re-entering Beijing. Having tested negative, I could continue to work in the lab at my university. I took my spore prints and thoroughly documented my specimen using the standard methods. On the third day of my return, my boyfriend Tao really started to worry about me. I was not eating, I had no appetite, but my stomach was constantly rumbling. He made me stay home in our apartment and kept trying to feed me my favorite foods. He is really kind, but whenever I tried to eat something it tasted so bad I felt like puking. On day 4 of not eating, Tao took me to the hospital. They ran all types of tests on me and asked many exhausting questions. All I wanted to do was sleep. I felt very weak. They put me on N4 and kept me overnight. Tao stayed with me. I don't remember anything, but he told me as best he could what happened. In the middle of the night, I suddenly stood up from my bed, awakening Tao, who was asleep on a folding bed beside me. My eyes were open, but I was unresponsive like a sleepwalker. I slowly started to walk out of my room and down the corridor, my mouth slightly agape. Despite the late hour, there was still some activity in the emergency wing. Someone was being amputated in a nearby operating room. I was apparently captivated by this, and when a nurse packaged an amputated leg for disposal, I followed. She brought it to a transfer facility to be made safe, a room where they prepare hazardous waste to be transferred and incinerated. Tao tried fruitlessly to wake me and hold me back, but as the nurse left I slipped into the empty transfer room and tore through the thick plastic waste bag with my nails. Tao described me as having inhuman strength, and nothing he tried would stop me. When I brushed him away, he was knocked down with incredible force. I consumed the entire leg, ripping the flesh from the bone like a rabid dog. The bones then crunching like cereal in my jaw. Thinking back on this, I am so ashamed. How could my body and subconscious commit such a savage act? Tao did not state this, but I knew his opinion of me was gravely tarnished. I'm however so thankful for him as he stayed by my side and did not give up on me. He cleaned the blood from my face and hands that night. He found me new clothes and managed to get me back into my bed without alerting any of the staff to what I had done. I asked him why and he said, "I didn't want them to take you away." When I awoke the next day, I felt re-energized and was actually smiling. I was released despite Tao's insistence that they do more tests. But the doctors needed the beds for COVID patients and could find nothing wrong with me. When we got home, that's when Tao told me of my midnight episode. I did not believe him, but he showed me the blood under my nails and I broke down crying and afraid. I tried to throw up in the toilet but nothing came up. Tao was worried that if it happened again, he couldn't control me, I was too strong. We agreed that he would tie me to the bed tonight just in case. I had been tied to our bed before actually, and not against my will. Despite the bondage, my boyfriend was not attracted to me that night, and I cannot blame him. He was very quiet and kept his distance. I was worried that he would never see me the same way again. I wanted to prove to him I was a normal person, but I had trouble believing it myself. What was happening to me? Tao spent the day on his PC playing his favorite game, Sword Fairy, a replica of a sword from the game on the wall above him. I'm glad that he's playing it now, keeping busy. I used to hate to see him play it so much when I was in need of attention, and I admit, I sometimes fantasized that the sword above him would fall on his neck. When I fell asleep, I had nightmares of being trapped in the cave, the rancid brain like mushrooms surrounding me, unleashing their spore clouds. Tao was not in bed when I woke up. I was still tied. When he saw that I was awake, he came over to untie me. Did I do it again? I asked. The look in his eye said it all. I looked at my legs and wrists. They were scratched from where I struggled against my restraints. As Tao leaned over me to free my arm, I saw the mark on his ear. What happened to your ear, Tao? He did not answer at first. Tao, in the night, you bit me. I was devastated and afraid, even though I did not know at the time what this would lead to. I didn't know if I was more scared of what was happening to me or more afraid of losing Tao. I'm sure he saw me for what I now was, a monster. To take my mind off things, I returned to the lab to continue my studies. It was the weekend and I was there alone. I was studying the spore print under the microscope. I isolated a single spore on a slide, and what I saw was unlike any spore I'd seen before. It resembled a virus rather than a spore, but on a much larger scale. On top of that, it was moving. I had to prepare 3 more samples to be sure. While examining the 3rd slide, I coughed, and to my shock, a dozen more spores appeared on the slide. I took a clean slide, spat on it, and confirmed that my saliva was full of spores. Panic set in. When I'm anxious, I clean. It somehow makes me feel better. I thoroughly cleaned all the equipment, with the strongest disinfectants in the lab. I packaged the mushroom cap and spore print in a dozen layers of specimen bags and labeled it as extremely hazardous before storing it in the ULT freezer. In the hall of my apartment building, I ran into my neighbor's child. When her parents are fighting, which is often, she plays with her dolls in the hall outside our door. When she saw me, she fled back inside her apartment and locked the door. As I entered my own apartment, I looked in the mirror. I had dark circles under my eyes, which themselves were dilated and bloodshot, my skin pale and my lips were a grayish purple. The feeling of not liking my own reflection is familiar to me. The feeling of being frightened by my own reflection was heartbreaking. Just by looking at Tao, I knew he was infected too. He started experiencing symptoms the next day. They were the same as mine, but at an accelerated pace. He did not get his period. At this point, I attempted to notify the media, to warn people of our sickness. No one I spoke to took us seriously, and all the posts I made online disappeared within hours. It was like screaming my warning into a void. I called my parents who lived in Shandong. I did not give them the full story, but they were still concerned and volunteered to come look after me. I told them that I would get over it soon. I did not want to subject them to the illness, and entering Shanghai is difficult under the current restrictions. Tao and I took turns sleeping that night, each of us watching over the other. Tao reported increased thrashing in my sleep. I even broke one of the restraints. My hunger was returning. During my turn watching over him, I was constantly chewing my own nails until there was almost nothing left. If this was nerves or hunger, I do not know. The next day we stayed in. I knew the mushroom was the source of our sickness, but Tao spent all his time online, researching our symptoms. When he stood up, I thought he had found something, but he was unresponsive. He must have fallen asleep at his desk. He stood there for a long time, not moving, back turned to me. There was a voice in the hall outside. His attention snapped towards the door and he grabbed the handle, fumbling with the lock. I tried to stop him, but he brushed me aside and pulled the door open. The young girl was out there again. I could see her through his legs, sitting on the floor with her toys spread out around her in a circle. Tao grabbed her by the leg, lifting her with ease towards his drooling mouth. The girl screamed. I jumped on Tao's back, my arms around his neck. He thrashed around to throw me off. His jaw snapped mechanically open and closed, inches from the girl's flesh. I swung all my weight against his neck, causing him to topple backwards through the open door of our apartment. We tumbled as a group, crashing into his PC desk. He dropped the girl as he fell. I yelled at her to run, but she just sat there, paralyzed with fear. I hit Tao on the head with a heavy ceramic plant pot. It did not faze him. He tossed me aside and I crashed into the wall next to his computer. He pounced on the girl like some great possessed ape. Tears streamed her face. There was no chance of her escape. And that's when I did it. I brought the sword down on his neck. The replica sword had no sharpened edge, but the sheer weight of it against flesh was enough to nearly decapitate Tao. His broken spinal cord caused his body to fall limp on top of the girl, his head half attached. His mouth continued to snap open and closed until I swung the second blow, severing his head completely from his neck. I rolled his body away from the girl. She was unharmed, not even soiled. She ran off screaming and I closed the door behind her. And then I cried, alone and afraid. I cried for a long time. And I waited, thinking that soon the police would be here and my ordeal would be over. I was relieved in a sense. It would now be in their hands. If they locked me up, then I couldn't hurt anyone else. But no one came and I couldn't keep myself awake. So I locked the apartment door from the inside and threw the key out the window. The next day I awoke to what looked like a burglary. My apartment was trashed, broken glass, upturned furniture and blood on the walls. It was no burglary though, it was me. The apartment door had been savagely clawed at and would probably not hold me for another night. My fingers were bloody and raw, but I felt no pain. I caught myself in the mirror to see I've pulled out most of my hair. There was hair stuck between my teeth. I must have been eating it. And there, in the middle of the floor, lay my beloved Tao. In a moment of fear and sadness, I tried to end it. I grabbed a shard of glass and cut myself. There was no pain and little blood, as if the blood inside me had all dried up. Clinging to the large shard of glass with my bare hands, I plunged it into my own stomach. I coughed a bit of tar like blood, but otherwise there was no real consequence. I was trapped in this monstrous body until I wasted away. Out of fear for myself and for the rest of humanity, I chained my neck with a bike lock to a sturdy radiator. I'm sure if I break free that the apartment door won't hold for long. I've since come to regret this decision. I'm not sure how many days it's been, but Tao's decaying body is now covered with small mushrooms. When they finally do find us, the infection will likely spread. I wish I had burned this place down. But instead, I am stuck here with my phone and my boyfriend's decaying corpse. Stay safe. I sent Krampus a letter when I was young. A few days later, I received a response. My son is about 9.5 years old now, and I have no doubt that he is the joy of my life. My wife died a few years back, so it's just been me and him. I've worked hard to make up for the fact that he doesn't have a mother anymore, and I feel glad to see that he's just like any other boy his age. Happy, gleeful, innocent. But the story I'm about to write has nothing to do with him. He did, however, help me remember it. For some context, I've always been uneasy during Christmas time, and I only really started to celebrate it when my wife, on her deathbed, told me to make sure our son would always have a grand Christmas. She died on Christmas Eve, and every year since then, I've always made sure to go all out on Christmas. It's the only way I know I can make this time of year easier for my son and for myself. I could never remember why the holiday joy of Old Saint Nick was something I never liked or looked forward to, but a few days ago my son announced that he would be writing his own letter to Santa Claus, as he had been working hard to perfect his handwriting and grammar. And as he scampered up the stairs and into his room to do just that, I felt myself freeze mid-sip of my drink. The mug slipped from my hand and shattered against the floor below my stiff hand. That's when it all came back to me. something I myself had forgotten, but my bones and subconscious certainly had not. Something which had terrified me so badly that upon remembering it, I became as still as a marble statue. The following is a recounting of what my son made me remember. The event in question took place when I was 11 and was finishing the 5th grade. A blessed time, I should say. Puberty had yet to hit, and I was without a care in the world. Well, almost. You see, there was this boy in my school. His name is still engraved in my mind. Timothy Herzmauser, but everyone called him Tim. Tim was nearly a foot taller than me, as he had been held back twice. And he was, as you've probably guessed by now, the stereotypical bully, always looking to cause trouble at every corner. Sound innocent? Well, by adult standards, it really was. A push here, a shove there, an insult sprinkled on top. Just little things that can be brushed over. For 11-year-old me, though, he was evil incarnate, worse than serial killers or terrorists. I think that's the part that insults me the most about this memory. He was just a bad kid. Not a bad person. And what happened makes me feel just so much more guilty. It all came to a breaking point when one day, the day before Christmas break started, I was writing my letter to Santa Claus. I was a bit embarrassed because I was at the age where writing letters to Santa Claus wasn't really seen as something that was acceptable anymore. I thought of myself as being a year too old to still write him, but I did so nonetheless. I was sitting on a bench near the school playground during recess, as oblivious to my surroundings as can be, writing my letter with a smile on my face, when all of a sudden it was snatched away from my mittened hands. I looked up and saw Tim waving the letter up and over his head, shouting at everyone about what I was doing. The embarrassment I felt at that moment has yet to be matched, even now, nearly 30 years later. I got angry and charged at him, but that pubescent boy had no trouble shoving me to the ground like a rag doll. I laid on the tarmac, crying both out of pain and out of embarrassment, but mostly the latter. I don't remember much about what happened afterwards. All I remember is that when I came home, I rushed up the stairs to my room, just like my son did, and slammed the door shut. Night had fallen when I opened my eyes, and I was sitting on my desk, a pen in my right hand and an unfinished letter before me. The only word on it was "Dear." Around me on the floor were countless crumpled up balls of paper, and I remembered that I had been writing the most hateful letters to Santa about Tim, asking old Saint Nick to give him a fat truckload of coal for Christmas, but I would end up crumpling each on up and starting anew. As I stared at the blank piece of paper, only one thing came to mind. I wrote after "Dear" the only word that wouldn't make me crumple this letter up. Krampus. The letter went as so.
Dear Krampus, this Christmas I want a present only you can give. I know you punish bad kids, and I know one kid who is the baddest of them all. His name is Timothy Herzmauser, and he is a bully in my school who bullies me every day. Santa giving him coal isn't enough for me. I want him gone and punished. That is all I want for Christmas this year. From Sam.
I put it in an envelope and marked it with my address and a dozen post stamps. When it came to the delivery address, I wrote South Pole because, with my little kid logic, I surmised that since Krampus is the polar opposite of Santa, that must mean that he lives in the other pole. I ran out, nearly trampling my little sister, who was 2 years younger than me, and rushed outside where I dropped my letter in the outgoing mailbox. Life went on after that, and I forgot about that letter. I admit that this post has been sparse on details thus far, but you have to understand that 30 years erodes one's memory quite a bit. But even so, I will never forget the day I got that letter in my mailbox. On that day, I vaguely remember my mother telling me to go pick up the mail outside, or was it my father? And the closer I get to my mailbox in my head, the stronger the memory becomes. I opened the mailbox, and among our usual mail, I found the oddest of letters. My memory of this is the strongest and most vivid. I still remember how the rough parchment caressed the skin of my small hands, and how the beautiful wax seal of an onyx black candle greeted me. I stopped paying attention to the world around me, wholly hypnotized by the letter. I opened it where I stood, and the memory of me writing my letter to him came back in an instant as I read what this letter contained. Words with beautiful, but hard to decipher, handwriting streaked across a vellum surface. I read each and every one, even though it took all of my effort to do so, and, in doing so, I burned those wretched things in my mind like a true Christmas curse. Dear Samuel,
My frozen heart within my furry chest was thawed by your letter. I hardly ever receive any correspondence here in the South Pole, and it really does get quite lonely where I reside. I leapt up with joy and clacked my hooves when one of my helping elves brought me your letter. Of course, Samuel, of course I shall get rid of that nasty Timothy Herzmauser for you. I shall ensure that a good little lad like you will never have to be bothered by the likes of a boy like him ever again. Dearly yours, Krampus.
The signature was horrendous, but also beautiful. If I had to compare it to something, it would be as if Mozart or Beethoven were stricken by a seizure mid-performance, but they still continued to play, producing a beautifully vile sound as their genius would not allow for anything less. The date was December the 16th, 1992. I'm ashamed to say that I hadn't understood the gravity of my actions. But then again, what the hell was I expecting? I was high on bravado, too old to be frightened by my terrible actions and too old to have thought twice before doing it. The days flew by, one by one like the ticks of a grandfather clock. Christmas Eve finally came. December 24th, 1992. I could have stayed in bed and slept through everything. But I just had to see him. I would do what no one had ever dared to do. I would catch a glimpse of Krampus. My plan was perfect. Well, the living room arrangement was perfect, so to speak. You see, my living room was a tad small, which is why it was arranged the way it was. It was located on the second floor of my house, connected with the kitchen and with windows that faced the front yard. If you climbed down from the third floor to the second floor, you'd find yourself in the living room, with an open doorway that led to the kitchen on your left. Between the stairs and the wall on your right was a large television which sat on a large TV bench. Opposite the television was a fireplace where we'd hung our stockings, and right next to it was a grand Christmas tree that we had all carefully decorated as a family on the first day of December. My plan was to hide behind the TV and wait for Krampus to come. I don't remember if I actually planned to confront him or not. The next strong memory I have is sitting on the floor behind the TV. The gentle fire gave me light so I wouldn't be frightened by the dark. I sat for who knows how long, dozing in and out. My memory gets hazy here, but then, like the flashing click of a camera, a memory as clear as pure spring water comes to mind. Something which made me sober out of my sleep at the drop of a hat and pay close attention as if I was hearing the final words of a dying man.
What on earth are you doing here?
A whispered shout echoed. I jerked awake and felt a jolt of adrenaline course through my body. The voice that answered the question is one that made my skin crawl as if my muscles had excreted maggots. Imagine if the deepest voice you can think of spoke while sharpening a knife against jagged rock so that each stroke matched with every syllable spoken by them. That's the best way I can describe the voice that I heard.
I was invited here, brother.
Krampus spoke, and to this day I wonder how I was able to keep my bladder and bowls full. Just remembering it as an adult sends shivers down my spine, let alone being 11 years old. Bullshit. The other voice shouted in a whisper. I heard the sound of paper rustling, and a deafening silence ensued. You, the kind voice said, he has no idea what he has done and you know damn well of as much.
Maybe so.
The gravelly voice of iron groaned.
But still, it would, in fact, be quite rude if I let it go unanswered. Do you not agree?
Leave. The kind voice demanded.
Now, dear brother, there is no such need for you to become impatient.
The voice was shaking my insides as though I'd swallowed a speaker playing heavy metal.
I will leave in due time. I just not with this present.
The hell you are.
And who are you to say that?
Sleep was tightening its grip on me, which is why I missed the next part. Out of the both of us, Santa said, only my hands hold a present. Your claws grip something that is only punishment and nothing else. I can tell as much, and I refuse to let you leave whatever vile atrocity you've wrapped under this fine fir tree lest I be struck dead by the screams and fright you shamelessly wish to incite. This is your last chance to leave, brother, or I promise to use force if you still insist on being a stubborn mule. A soft chuckle from Krampus pierced the air, and I felt as though I'd been dropped in the middle of the Arctic Ocean while my feet were stuck in a block of concrete.
Now, brother,
Krampus said as gently as his voice would allow.
Let things not get as ugly as they did back in March 1888 or in November 1940. Especially now during the month of joy. You wouldn't want to ruin your very own holiday, would you?
The hushed arguing continued, and I gradually found myself falling deeper and deeper into sleep, no longer able to fight it. I collapsed on the floor and blacked out. I awoke to shrill shrieks stabbing my eardrums. My mother was standing in front of the tree, dropped presents she most likely wanted to put under it now scattered all throughout the floor like neglected toys. When the police came and I told them my story and showed them the letter, they believed me. Just not in the way I hoped. They surmised that my letter had been intercepted by some sick bastard and he'd taken it upon himself to take on the role of Krampus. I had heard him have a mental breakdown in my living room, his mind completely disconnected from reality. They never did find him as they promised. Or the rest of Tim. But I do remember one thing, which although it is the haziest, it also the one that scarred me the most. As I collapsed on the floor from exhaustion on that night, in the brief period before my eyes collapsed shut, I saw through the gap between the T.V. bench and the floor a pair of thick snow boots facing a pair of blackened and rough hooves, a drop of blood falling down on the floor in front of the fire and in front of me before my eyes slammed shut.